My son-in-law stood at the head of the boardroom table like he already owned the place. And technically, I suppose he was working on it, since my daughter had just been made regional VP 6 months prior. I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I'm not telling this story because I'm bitter. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years in infrastructure procurement for the federal government, and I've seen enough boardrooms to know that the most dangerous person in any negotiation isn't the one across the table. It's the one beside you who thinks they understand what's happening. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that for most of my career, I was the person you called when a contract was about to go sideways. Not because I was the smartest guy in the room, I'll be honest about that, but because I'd been in enough rooms to know which silences meant yes, which ones meant no, and which ones meant you just insulted someone's entire organization without realizing it. I worked 32 years with Public Services and Procurement Canada. I started at the bottom, pushing paper in an Ottawa office building that smelled like photocopier toner and old coffee. By the time I was in my early 40s, I was leading negotiations on major infrastructure contracts, bridges, transit systems, flood management. The kind of contracts where a single clause written wrong can cost a province $500 million. I'd worked with Indigenous community leaders, with municipal governments in Quebec who didn't always feel like speaking English, with American defense contractors who had no idea how different our procurement rules were from theirs. You learn to read people in that environment. You learn that the contract is never just the contract. It's the relationship that makes the contract mean something. I took early retirement at 57, spent 2 years doing some consulting on the side, mostly through referrals, mostly quiet work. Then my daughter's company, a mid-sized civil engineering and construction management firm based in Calgary, started landing larger federal contracts, green energy infrastructure, highway rehabilitation, the kind of work that needed someone who understood the government side of the table. My daughter asked if I'd come back in a part-time capacity as a senior advisor, help them navigate the process. I said yes. I want you to understand something about my daughter. She's sharp. She earned her position. She worked for that company for 11 years before she was promoted. She and I don't always agree, but I've always respected her judgment. The problem wasn't my daughter. The problem was who she'd married. My son-in-law came into her life about 4 years ago. He had an MBA from Schulich, a confident handshake, and the kind of energy that fills a room whether you want it to or not. He'd worked in private equity for a while, then pivoted into operational consulting. He'd never worked in government procurement a day in his life, which, fine, not everyone needs to. But he had opinions about it. Very loud opinions, too. His name, I'll call him what most people at the office called him behind his back, which was the son-in-law, and I'll leave it at that. When my daughter made regional VP, he started attending more internal strategy sessions. Nobody had officially given him a role. He was just there, present, asking questions that sounded insightful until you understood the subject matter well enough to realize they weren't questions at all. They were conclusions dressed up as questions. The specific contract that matters here was a federal highway rehabilitation tender in northern British Columbia. Infrastructure Canada, roughly $230 million over 5 years. Significant by any measure. We had a strong position going in. We'd done similar work in Saskatchewan 2 years prior. We had the relationship with the regional PSPC office. We understood the Indigenous consultation requirements for that corridor. And we had a subcontractor already aligned who knew that terrain. I'd spent 3 months preparing our submission strategy. It was methodical, careful, and built around what I knew the evaluation committee actually cared about, which, in federal procurement, is almost never what it says it cares about in the RFP. The son-in-law looked at what I'd built and said it was too conservative. He'd been sitting in on strategy sessions for about 6 weeks by that point, and he'd become convinced that we were leaving value on the table by not leading with data. He wanted to restructure the technical proposal to front-load statistical modeling outputs. He'd found some software, an AI-driven proposal optimization tool that some startup in Toronto was selling to engineering firms. The pitch was that it could analyze past successful federal tenders and essentially reverse engineer the scoring criteria. I told him it didn't work like that. He asked me how I knew. I told him because I had been on the evaluation side of these committees. I knew what the actual scoring culture was. The data matters, but it's not the first thing evaluators are looking for. They're looking for evidence that you understand the project, that you've actually thought about the specific risks of this specific corridor, that you're not submitting a boilerplate proposal with the project name changed in the header. The human judgment in those rooms is not something you can reverse engineer from pattern matching on past submissions. He nodded slowly while I said all of this, the way someone nods when they've already decided you're wrong and they're just being polite about it. 2 days later, he presented his revised approach to my daughter and the CEO. I wasn't in that meeting. I found out about it afterward. The AI tool he was using had reformatted our entire technical narrative into a modular structure optimized, according to the software, for PSPC scoring metrics. It had stripped out most of the contextual language I'd written about the specific geographic and regulatory challenges of that corridor. It had replaced it with benchmark comparisons to projects in Ontario and Alberta that weren't remotely comparable. It had also somehow changed our proposed project timeline in a way that conflicted with the Indigenous consultation schedule we'd already informally agreed to with the Band Council. I brought this up to my daughter directly. I told her specifically, the consultation timeline is wrong, and this will register as either incompetence or bad faith with the band, which will kill us during the consultation scoring phase. She said she'd look into it. What happened next, I still don't entirely understand. I think my daughter was in a difficult position. She was trying to balance my concerns against her husband's enthusiasm, and she didn't want to make a call that looked like she was taking sides. I understand that. It's an impossible situation. But the call she ended up making was to let the proposal go out as he'd structured it, with a minor note added back in about the consultation schedule that didn't actually fix the fundamental problem. The proposal went in on a Thursday in late March. I knew within a week. I got a call from someone I know at the regional PSPC office. Not official information, just a professional courtesy. The kind of thing that happens when you've been in this world long enough. The Band Council had submitted a formal objection during the technical review phase. Not a complaint, an objection. Specifically about the consultation timeline. They'd flagged that the schedule in our proposal was inconsistent with conversations they believed they'd had with our team. The evaluation committee had placed our submission under review pending clarification. In practice, this meant we were effectively out. I walked into my daughter's office and told her. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the wall behind me, the way people do when they're working out what to say. I told her I wasn't there to say I told you so. I told her I was there because we needed to decide how to respond to Infrastructure Canada in a way that preserved our standing for future tenders, even if this one was gone. She asked me if there was anything we could do to save it. I said no, and I meant it gently, but I meant it. What happened after that is where things got complicated in a way I hadn't expected. The son-in-law found out about the objection the same afternoon. His response was not what I would have chosen. He drafted an internal memo, which somehow got shared more widely than he intended, suggesting that the Band Council's objection was procedurally questionable and that we should be exploring whether Infrastructure Canada's handling of the review process was compliant with their own guidelines. I want to be careful about how I say this next part. There is a version of that concern that is legitimate. Federal procurement processes are not perfect. Objection processes can sometimes be used strategically. These are real conversations that happen in this industry. But the way he'd framed it, in writing, in a memo that was now circulating, wasn't a careful legal inquiry. It was a grievance. It read like someone who'd never worked with Indigenous consultation processes before, who didn't understand that this wasn't a procedural technicality, who was treating a relationship that had taken years to build like it was an obstacle to be challenged. I heard about the memo on a Friday afternoon. I went home that weekend without saying anything. On Monday morning, I came in and asked to speak with the CEO. I want to be honest about this part. I was angry. Not loud angry. I've never been loud angry. It's not how I'm built, but I was the kind of angry that settles in behind your eyes and makes everything very clear. I sat down across from the CEO, a man I'd known professionally for about a decade, and I told him exactly what I thought. I told him that what had happened with this proposal was recoverable. Companies lose tenders. It's not the end of the world. What was not recoverable if it continued was our relationship with that Band Council. our reputation with the PSPC regional office, and our ability to compete on any future Northern BCC work if it became known that we'd responded to a legitimate consultation objection by questioning the process. I told him that the memo needed to be retracted quietly, professionally, with an apology to the band council that was genuine and not lawyered to death. And I told him something else. I told him that I could not continue to be involved in a professional capacity if the approach to federal procurement work was going to be driven by someone who didn't understand it, using tools designed for a type of work that was fundamentally different from what we were doing. The CEO sat there for a while. He's a measured man. He asked me some questions. He didn't defend the son-in-law, but he didn't agree with me either, not directly. He said he appreciated my perspective. He said he'd think about it. 2 days later, my daughter called me. She said the company had decided to restructure my advisory role. They were moving to a more project-specific model. I would still be consulted on an as-needed basis, but the standing advisory arrangement was ending. I said I understood. She said she hoped I understood it wasn't personal. I said I did. I want to tell you what I actually felt in that moment because I think it matters for the rest of this. I wasn't devastated. I was 61 years old. I didn't need the income. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of grief maybe, for the version of events where she'd called me instead and asked me what I thought she should do. That version existed. It was possible. She could have made that call. She didn't, but I also understood why. I left the office that afternoon, drove home, and told my wife what had happened. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. When I finished, she said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I think I want to call Hennessy. Patrick Hennessy's, I can use his name because he gave me permission to tell this story, was someone I'd worked alongside at PSPC about 15 years earlier. He'd gone private sector around the same time I did, but he'd gone in a different direction. He'd joined a larger firm, one of the national engineering groups, and worked his way into their federal infrastructure division. We'd stayed in touch, occasionally grabbed lunch when I was in Toronto, exchanged emails when something interesting came through the industry. I called him on a Tuesday evening. We talked for about an hour. He had a position that had been hard to fill, a senior procurement strategy role for their Western Canada federal portfolio. He'd been thinking about calling me for a few months, he said, but he didn't want to poach me if I was happy where I was. I told him I was no longer where I was. He said, "Okay. When can we talk properly? I want to skip ahead a little because what happened next at my daughter's company isn't something I know all the details of. I wasn't there anymore. What I do know, I know from conversations with a couple of former colleagues who stayed in touch and from some things my daughter eventually told me herself, months later. The memo her husband sent did not stay quiet. Someone forwarded it, I don't know who, to a contact at the band council. The band council shared it with their legal representative. The legal representative sent a formal letter to the company, not threatening litigation, but making clear that the relationship was being reassessed. 3 other tenders that the company had been preparing, all in northern BC and the Yukon, all involving consultation components, were affected. 2 procurement offices indicated informally that the company's reputation in those processes had become complicated. 1 tender they'd been considered a frontrunner for went to a competitor. The AI proposal tool that my son-in-law had championed was quietly dropped about 4 months after I left. I heard about this through someone at the company who mentioned it in passing, without connecting it to anything, as though it were just a mundane operational update. My daughter and I didn't talk much for about 6 months. Not out of anger, or at least not primarily, but because neither of us quite knew how to have the conversation we needed to have, and so we kept having smaller ones instead. How are the kids? Have you talked to your brother lately? The weather's been weird this spring. In November, she called me and asked if I wanted to have dinner, just the 2 of us. We went to a place in Calgary that we'd been going to since she was a teenager. It's a little Italian restaurant on a side street that has never been fashionable, but has always been very good. We ordered what we always order. We talked around the subject for about half an hour. Then she said, "I think we made some mistakes." I asked her which one she meant. She said the proposal, and some other things. I told her I appreciated that. She said she wasn't sure what to do about the situation at work. She didn't say it in so many words, but I understood what she was describing. The difficulty of being in an organization where the lines between professional authority and personal relationship had gotten tangled in a way that was hard to untangle. I didn't tell her what to do. That's not my place. But I told her something that I believed, which was that the companies that survive in federal procurement are the ones that understand the difference between a process and a relationship. You can optimize a process. You can't optimize a relationship. You can only build it and protect it, and sometimes the way you protect it is by knowing when not to move fast. She sat with that for a while. Then she picked up her fork and said, "You sound like you always do." I said, "Is that a bad thing?" She said, "No," and we ate our dinner. The position with Hennessy's firm worked out well. Better than I expected, honestly. I spend most of my time on strategy and stakeholder relations for their federal work. Exactly the kind of thing I was doing before, but for a larger shop with more resources and a culture that, from what I can tell, hasn't confused cleverness with expertise. I got a call about 8 months in from someone at a competing firm, asking if I'd be willing to consult on a northern BC project. I recognized the project. It was one of the tenders that my daughter's company had lost ground on. I said I wasn't available, but gave them a name of someone else who might be. Last month, I was at an industry event in Vancouver. I ran into someone from the regional PSPC office, the same one who'd called me that spring with the informal heads-up. We had a coffee. He asked how things were going. I told him I'd landed somewhere good. He said, "Yeah, I heard." Then he said, "You know what the thing is about people who understand this work?" And he paused for a second. "They're not that common." I said, "Well, the ones who know they don't understand it are rarer still." He laughed. I laughed. We finished our coffees. On the drive back to the hotel, I thought about something my father used to say. He wasn't in procurement. He was a carpenter, a good one in a small town in Ontario. But he had a line he'd use when someone hired for a job thought they already knew more than the job required. He'd say confidence is a fine tool, but it doesn't cut anything on its own. I think about that a fair bit these days. My son-in-law and I are civil. We see each other at family things. He's good with the grandkids, I'll give him that. He's smart, I'll give him that too. He's just, and I say this with more charity now than I had in March of last year, still in the part of his life where he doesn't yet know what he doesn't know. Most of us were there once. The difference is whether someone's your life is willing to tell you before it costs you something real.